So our next presenter is Eve Chavez. She is assistant professor in the Department of History of Art and Visual Culture in the University of Santa Cruz. Her specialty is the art and visual culture of the indigenous Americas, Latin America, and Native California, with the emphasis on California missions and Spanish borderlands. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Eve Chavez to present Female Artists, Indigenous Knowledge, and the California Missions.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all of the organizers for putting on this special event and for inviting me. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Tongva people on whose land we are gathered. So I am actually Tongva through my maternal grandmother, and our Tongva ancestors lived and worked at Mission San Gabriel, which you see here. It is the mission that is located closest to Cal State LA, and it was the fourth of 21 missions that Franciscan mendicant friars established in Alta California between 1769 and 1834. These missions are known for their rich collections of Spanish colonial art and iconic architecture. At these sites, indigenous peoples negotiated Spanish power structures and appropriated foreign ideas to create portable objects rooted in native Californian practices. As part of a larger study on indigenous artistic agency in California's missions, my presentation focuses on the work of female artists, both within and outside of the missions, who preserved their cultural knowledge by seizing opportunities to make baskets for non-native patrons into the early 20th century. By examining basketry practices from the years of California's Spanish occupation through statehood, I argue that the impacts of the Spanish conquest extended well beyond the mission era, as seen in the work of indigenous artists who continued to accommodate a non-native fascination with the missions well into the early 20th century. California occupies a unique position within the larger context of the Spanish conquest. Though it controlled California for only 52 years, Spain left a lasting impact on the region and its inhabitants. This impact continues to be seen in California's Spanish Revival architecture, city and street names, mission museum narratives, and mission fiestas, to name a few examples. For indigenous Californians, the 21 missions located between San Diego and Sonoma serve as reminders of the oppression of our cultures and the decimation of our populations. I began by discussing basket weaving practices in Southern California and the strategies Native artists employed to sustain their weaving after Spanish colonization. Then I turned to the years after Mexican independence and California statehood. To foreground my analysis of weaving practices in Southern California, I began with an overview of basketry techniques and materials. The main types of baskets found in California are either coiled or twined. Coiled baskets consist of wefts that are wrapped around a foundation that spirals about a center knot, whereas twined baskets follow a web-like pattern. In Southern California, warps are typically made of juncus, tule, willow, or sumac, all native plants, which are also used for the wefts that tie the warps together. While the wefts weave around the foundation of a coiled basket, wefts weave in and twist around warps and twine baskets. And here I show these diagrams just to give you a sense. The tribes of Northern California predominantly weave twined baskets, whereas the tribes from the Pomo in the region just north of San Francisco all the way south to the Kumeyaay in San Diego make both twined and coiled baskets. Tribes in coastal Southern California are best known for their tightly woven coiled baskets, and that's what I'll be focusing on today. These baskets captured the attention of early explorers and colonists who remarked on the quality of the baskets they saw and received while traveling along Southern California's coast. A member of the Vancouver expedition, which reached California in 1792, acquired this basket, which is now in the British Museum collection. For this one-of-a-kind basket, the weaver took a traditional basket cap shape and added a wide brim to create the appearance of a sombrero, or hat, like the friars wore at the missions. Between 1697 and 1767, Jesuit missionaries established and oversaw 16 Catholic missions in the Baja California Peninsula. After Spain expelled the Jesuits from its territories, a group of 15 Franciscan friars under the leadership of Junipero Serra arrived in Loreto in 1768 to oversee the Jesuit missions. The Franciscans only established one mission in Baja California before they moved north to claim and occupy Alta California, out of concern about the growing presence of Russian fur traders who were moving south from Alaska. On July 16, 1769, Serra established the first mission of San Diego de Alcalá in the Kumeyaay homelands in San Diego, California. During Serra's tenure, the Franciscans also founded Mission San Gabriel in 1771, and that was originally situated at a different site in present-day Whittier. And to the north in the Chumash region, the Franciscans established Mission San Buenaventura in 1782. Chumash and Tongva weavers continued to make baskets at these missions, as seen in the hat-shaped basket. Within California's coastal communities, women typically were responsible for gathering native plants, weaving baskets, as well as collecting and preparing food in baskets. They also made regalia, which both men and women wore during ceremonies. Men also contributed to the making of cultural materials. Activities were more fluid within Native communities and became more rigid and defined by gender at the missions. Women were responsible for doing laundry, preparing meals, and working in the fields. Men worked as blacksmiths, gunsmiths, carpenters, soapmakers, shoemakers, masons, farmers, and shepherds. And at the missions, education was also segregated by gender. Most California Indian women did not learn how to read and write in the missions. The Franciscans preferred to teach young Native boys how to read and write in Spanish rather than girls. So young women from elite families sometimes learned Spanish in private homes, which may have been the case with the 3 Chumash weavers who signed their names into the rims of these baskets that they made at Mission San Buenaventura. Baptized in their 20s, Juana Basilia Citameladin, Maria Marta Zaputimiu, and Maria Sebastiana Soatimewe are the only known weavers who wove Spanish text into baskets, as you can see here. Their Chumash names appear in baptismal records, yet they only included their Spanish names on their baskets. The weavers also incorporated designs found on the Spanish pillar dollar as well as the portrait dollar that circulated in California into the early 19th century. The pillar dollar is known for its portrayal of the Spanish coat of arms on its front, and on the reverse side it features interlocking globes flanked by the pillars of Hercules. The portrait dollar featured the king's head on the front and the Bourbon coat of arms on the back. Though it is unclear how the weavers acquired the pesos, it is possible that the mission friar let them borrow the coins. By encouraging the weavers to make baskets with symbols for the monarch, the Franciscans reinforced their loyalty to Spain at a time of increasing tension in New Spain. While it is unlikely that the weavers supported the oppressive monarch, the opportunity to weave baskets for political and church leaders would have meant that they could experiment with new designs and continue to exercise their weaving skills. As noted, mission inhabitants performed duties that served the needs of the mission. Basket making requires months of cultivating and gathering native plants that required weeks of processing and dyeing of the materials. And then finally, it would have taken months to weave the materials into the tightly stitched baskets with these carefully placed patterns. Prior to colonization, weavers adopted new patterns from neighboring communities. So it was not unusual that the three weavers from the mission recreated the coin designs and Spanish text in their baskets. Invoking their names, however, was an unprecedented move. It signaled the weavers' defiance of Franciscan patriarchy and an assertion of their status in California's evolving society as converts to Christianity. Including their names would not have served the friars' needs, but rather documented the weaver's skill and grasp of the Spanish language. It also signaled the weavers' foresight about passing on their legacy to future generations. While we do not know the weavers' intentions, the act of recording their names in this unconventional manner has made it possible for scholars and Native community members to trace these unique baskets to their makers. The practice of signing one's work has origins in the monastic tradition of scribes writing their names on manuscripts. By the 15th century, Italian artists began to sign their work for authentication and marketing purposes. Colonists who came to the Americas brought this practice and trained artists in Mexican art schools who adopted the approach. There were no formal art schools, workshops, or guilds that we know of in California during the years of Franciscan leadership. The friars brought artistic treatises from Europe, from which some of the indigenous artists borrowed ideas when they decorated mission churches. As far as can be deciphered from remnants of the mission's original decorations, these artists, who were mostly men, did not sign their work. The act of making religious art for theological instruction and devotion inherently demonstrated the artist's mastery of new techniques. But baskets, on the other hand, represented a non-Catholic indigenous practice that served the differing needs of female weaver and male colonist. By weaving their baptized names rather than their native names, the Chumash weavers would have eased any concerns on the part of church and government officials regarding the Franciscan success in reaching their goals. The baskets with Christian names and symbols taken from Spanish currency reinforced the church's goal in California to spread Catholicism and claim the region for Spain. The baskets also served the interests of enterprising friars, including the head missionary at Mission San Buenaventura, who sent baskets to Mexico City as payment for church decorations, and who encouraged the weavers to make baskets for specific recipients. Though it is unlikely the weavers were compensated for their work, future weavers seized opportunities to make baskets for non-native patrons willing to pay for baskets as collector's items. This basket tray in the collection of the National Museum of the American Indian is a unique example in which the weaver wove the recipient's name. Aside from the 3 baskets with weavers' names, this is the only known basket with Spanish text stating the recipient's name. Here the phrase "Soy de Catarina Ortega" appears twice, first within the center of the basket and then along the outer band. According to the museum, this basket was made for Maria Catarina Manuela Ortega, a granddaughter of Captain Jose Francisco Ortega, who was the commandant of several presidios in Southern California from 1773 until 1795. This early example of a commissioned basket foregrounded the curio trade that gained momentum in California in the late 19th century. Until then, not much is known about the state of basket weaving in California. A series of events, beginning with Mexico's independence, disrupted native lives and perhaps contributed to a lull in weaving. By 1834, the missions became parishes when California's new governor implemented the plan for secularization that transferred control from the Franciscan mendicant friars to secular priests. In 1846, the United States declared war on Mexico, and 2 years later, Mexico signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, making California a United States possession. Then, by 1850, California became the 31st state in the Union. By the time the United States acquired California, many indigenous people of Southern California had assimilated into Mexican and eventually Anglo-American society, and some no longer identified as Indians for fear of racial discrimination. The United States government placed Native American children in boarding schools where they were forced to abandon their indigenous customs. Some children from Southern California's indigenous communities were sent to the Sherman Institute in Riverside, California, along with Native children from the Pacific Northwest, the Southwest, and Plains regions. Boarding school students were punished for speaking any language other than English, and they were forced to dress and act like Anglo-American children. So this is not that different from what was happening in the missions. As the 20th century began, California's indigenous populations had endured forced religious conversion and assimilation, as well as drastic population decline. Before 1769, the California Indian population was about 310,000, and by 1845, the population had fallen to roughly 150,000. And those numbers are debatable, but those are the more reliable ones. Surviving California Indians adopted new identities, including those imposed by colonial powers. The Tongva and other converts at Mission San Gabriel, for instance, became known as Gabrielinos. The Mission San Juan Capistrano inhabitants were known as Juaneños, and so forth. You get the idea, they're named after the missions. Anthropologist Alfred Kroeber embraced this naming system when he created a labeling approach for Southern California Indian basketry in the 1920s. According to Kroeber, the Mission Indians were people who inhabited the area surrounding 10 of Southern California's missions: San Diego, San Luis Rey, San Juan Capistrano, San Gabriel, San Fernando, San Buenaventura, Santa Barbara, Santa Ynez, La Purísima, and San Luis Obispo. This does not account for the remaining 11 missions north of San Luis Obispo that also impacted communities living directly in the path of the missions. Instead, Kroeber's list is limited to the groups that shared similar weaving techniques. The publication also inferred that the style found in Southern California was somehow tied to the missions. Weavers certainly could have exchanged ideas that led to the emergence of new techniques or patterns within the context of the missions, but the missions as colonial institutions were not directly responsible for these changes. The weavers were. Not all mission Indians lived at the Franciscan missions. In the San Gabriel Valley, only a fraction of the Tongva-speaking peoples converted to Christianity and joined the missions. Like the Tongva, people in other coastal communities did not join these institutions, and some even avoided the missions by hiding in the surrounding mountains. Unfortunately, basket enthusiasts overlooked this fact and would use the mission Indian label to categorize baskets that signified a mythical Spanish past. In the 1880s, so I'm going back a little bit in time, in the 1880s and 90s, non-native collectors had taken an interest in collecting baskets, which they felt represented a dying race. So this was a national phenomenon where people thought Native Americans were going extinct. The collecting trend contributed to the removal of baskets from indigenous communities, which often ended up in museum collections. In response to this growing interest in California Indian baskets, weavers began to make them for sale to collectors from around 1890 through the 1920s. Like their ancestors who lived at the missions and made baskets for explorers and political leaders, these later weavers made baskets that appealed to a new audience. The arts and crafts movement had played a critical role in promoting basketry and other arts. Art dealer and Pennsylvania transplant Grace Nicholson seized this opportunity to sell native art, including the baskets from California that she sold in her curio shop in Pasadena beginning in 1902. And you can see a very cluttered shop full of baskets. She sought out the basketry produced in California, which she sold to wealthy, non-native collectors, including Phoebe Hearst, or the Phoebe Hearst Museum, as it is now known, and that's at UC Berkeley. 17 years before Nicholson had arrived in California, another East Coast native, Helen Hunt Jackson, wrote the wildly popular novel Ramona. This fictional story, based in Southern California, centered on the life of a half-native, half-Scottish woman raised on a Mexican rancho. Jackson wrote the novel to raise awareness of the injustices Native peoples were facing, particularly in California. Tourists flocked west in search of Ramona's place of birth, even though she never existed. But some came to believe that she was based on real-life women like Cahuilla weaver Ramona Lubo. Within the first decade of the 20th century, Mississippi-based collector Catherine Marshall Gardner acquired baskets like Ramona Lubo's. Marshall and other collectors particularly valued Lubo's work for its fine craftsmanship, but also its association with the popular Mission Indian style. Born in 1853 in Riverside County, Lubo was neither born at or near an active mission. Gardner also collected work by Lubo's contemporaries. Made between 1900 and 1901, their baskets significantly postdated the peak of the mission era. Though Gardner and basket enthusiasts like George Wharton James admired baskets by weavers who worked in this Mission Indian style, they did little to help improve the situation of Southern California's native peoples. The basket craze helped a few weavers in supporting their families into the early 20th century, but it proved unsustainable. From the 1920s and 1970s, basket weaving underwent a period of decline as Native peoples further assimilated into Anglo-American society. Native communities are reviving their basket weaving today, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done. Despite conforming to the demands of mission friars and later the consumer market, basket weavers found new ways to continue imbuing baskets with individual style. So I'd like to end with this basket by Ramona Lubo to underscore the complex history of the California Indian experience. Though collected as a mission Indian basket because of her perceived association with the missions, this basket tray bears no signs of Spanish influence. This approach of naming the baskets shows that the effects of the Spanish conquest continue to be felt in our communities, but thanks to the persistence of our ancestors, our tribes continue to achieve artistic success as seen in our rich basketry traditions. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Alessandra Russo. She is Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Latin American and Iberian Cultures at Columbia University. She teaches and studies the theory, practice, and display of the art in the early modern times. She curated with Gerhard Wolff and Diana Fain the exhibition El vuelo de las imágenes, and collaborated with Sergei Gruzinski in the curatorship of Planet Matisse. Professor Russo is presently completing the book titled A New Antiquity, Art and Humanity as Universal, 14,000 through 16,000. Please join me in welcoming Alessandra Russo to present Rethinking Art History with 1519.
Buenas tardes. Muchísimas gracias por esa invitación a todos, todas las organizadoras y muy en especial a Manuel por escribirme aquel día y decirme ven a hablar y por tu amabilidad. Así que muchas gracias. Gracias. In these 3 days, we have approached far and wide the multiple dimensions of an infamous anniversary and are certainly more aware now of the creative responses to the arrival of the strangers. The question that I would like to raise with my presentation is if we can study, teach, and practice art history in a singular way with 1519. As to say, does 1519 constitute, obviously retrospectively, a specific challenge for the field of art history at large? My working thesis is that 1519 triggered a vast creation of images and artifacts that are completely incomprehensible if we approach them through any disciplinary art history, meaning any art history that follows methodological assumptions prior to the encounter with the artifact itself. For instance, do these images respond to the assumption of a colonial art history? Can they be understood simply as byproducts of a political context of conquest, of colonization, and Christianization? Or do these images fit in the assumption of a global art history, comparable, for instance, to other images of arrivals that were painted on a global scale in Japan or Peru in the same years? My tentative answer is that the complexity of these artifacts, images, objects, cannot be approached but through an entire process of looking at them again and again, grasping the multiple dimensions references, temporalities, and concepts involved in their texture. There is, in short, no other art history of these objects than that indefatigable work of looking, searching in direction that we would not expect at first, and then look anew. As Jeanette Peterson pointed out, the printed book of a Scandinavian author on the people of Northern Europe can be as revelatory to approach the Florentine Codex as the presence of the earth glyph in the skirt of Malintzin, brilliantly seen by Diana Magaloni. So how to search simultaneously in all these directions and then look at the images again and again? And most importantly, what is the matter of these looking anew? To retake a concept brought up yesterday, we can say that the ultimate horizon of this looking anew is to get as close as possible to the truth of the image. And by truth of the image, I do not refer to the factual accuracy of the image, its capacity to portray what really happened. By truth of the image, I mean to get as close as possible to the creative process that resulted in the image itself. Let me briefly address some of the images that have played an iconic role in my own path as an art historian, and that I want to read anew today, having these bigger questions in mind. Several decades after the conquest, distinct group of painters, as we have seen, measured themselves with the same problem, inventing how to represent the contact between people, but also between times and spaces that had been independent or unknown to each other before 1519. Around 1580, as Christopher Driggers had reminded us, a Dominican friar, Diego Duran, wrote a history of the ancient Mexicans. It was 60 years after the conquest, and that was one of the painted books that staged the arrival, their mythical departure from Aztlan until the arrival of the Spaniards and the fall of Tenochtitlan. The Dominican had asked some Tlaquiloque for drawings in color to accompany his text. One of these drawings summarizes two key moments in the history of the Spanish conquest. On the left, 3 ships approach the coast, while on the right, Hernán Cortés, seated on a Spanish chair, speaks with a woman identified by the gloss Marina, meaning Malintzin, his famous interpreter. Behind the conquistador, called the Marqués, one of the envoys of the Tlatoani Moctezuma, Tlilancalqui, called Tlilancalqui, observes and listens attentively to the conversation. The image seems clear and calls for no particularly commentary. But if we pay attention, this representation of the arrival of the Spaniards is much more complex than it appears. The laborious presence of the details confront the apparent readability of the wall. The painting in the Codex Duran condenses into a single image 2 discrete moments. We see the imminent mooring of the 3 ships. The image seems even to evoke Columbus' 3 caravels as a sort of glyph of the arrival of the strangers, and the symbolic foundation of Iberian authority in the person of Hernán Cortés. But this painting reserves surprises for us. Marina Malintzin already has the look of a Spanish lady. She has undergone a subtle physical transformation. Not only do her clothing and gestures give her the appearance of a European woman, see her eloquent gestures calling attention to what she is saying, but the color of her hair undergoes a visible metamorphosis. On the arrival shore, it is colored the same yellow as Cortés's beard. Malintzin was certainly not blonde, but she becomes so in this interpretation of the reality of the conquest made by the Tlaquilo painter, as if to evoke one of the traits of the Spaniards that most impressed the Mesoamerican populations. The Florentine Codex is very clear. He portrays the conquistadors as follows. They have yellow hair, their beard is long and yellow. These are yellow beards. While the yellow probably refers also to the golden tint used in pre-Hispanic ceremonies, Malintzin Marina is perceived as taking on the color of the other, which is paradoxically the conquistador. a priestess chameleon, Marina, personifies and harbors as a Marina both the passage between and the rupture of the old and the new. Her multiple identities, chromatic and nominal, are in permanent transformation. In the Florentine Codex, she is even called Maria. As for Hernán Cortés, he sports a jolly plumed hat that recalls the felt once worn in the Iberian Peninsula at the time, while the plume evokes also one of the materials most charged with meaning in the Mesoamerican world. His hat, too, is a sort of hyphen between the old and the new worlds. To explore this type of image, therefore, we have to prepare to pass constantly from one world to another, from one time to another. We have to be ready, so to speak, to relive a little bit of the experience lived by the author of this painting. The Tlacuilo possessed visual archives that were both Mesoamerican and European, and we have reason to believe that he knew them well enough to allow himself such freedom of invention. This image, therefore, tells another story than the arrival of the strangers. Its truth, so to speak, is not that Marina was or was not blonde when Cortés arrived, but rather that the image is blowing apart the frontiers between visual traditions and histories of art, which until then had remained independent of each other. With this image, can we think of pre-Hispanic pictographic traditions separable from a European pictorial tradition? What impact did the European artistic world have had on the Mesoamerican artistic world, but also can we consider the painting from the Codex Duran also as being part of the Western history of art and recognize in it forms of interruption, even exceeding of artistic filiations, stylistic, iconographic material coming from the Old World? Rethinking the famous terminology used by Kubler, who spoke of the interruption of pre-Hispanic arts with the arrival of the Spaniards, can we also imagine that the European artistic configuration was also interrupted by contact with radically different visual practices? With the Spanish conquest, pre-Hispanic art was transformed forever, but on American land, European art also became something else and other than itself. This image is what Abiy would have called a difficult object, like those baskets that Eve just presented. Objects that cannot be studied according to a linear history of artistic periodizations, medieval, Renaissance, Mannerist, Baroque, but neither according to facile formulas like the extinction of pre-Hispanic art or indigenous resistance to imported hegemonic forms. It's much more complicated. Rather, exploring in both directions the deliberate tension between radically different artistic worlds will help us better grasp the absolute originality of images and objects created in this unprecedented conjecture. Another image of the Codex Duran that I particularly cherish is in order here. Before the image of the blonde Malinche, the Codex Duran represents how the envoys of Moctezuma had been sent to the coast to see the round mountain in the sea, as to say the ship. In this image, we see the ship, a boat with a man fishing, and on the shore, a tree with a man pointing toward the sea. The text coincides perfectly with what we are seeing. It explains that the envoys of Moctezuma climbed on a tree to see the round mountain, hiding so not to be seen. So if we search simply for a disagreement between image and text, here we are left with the surprise that there is not such a thing. But in fact, if we look anew in search of the true creative process of the image, we can get close to this process. In fact, the painter has borrowed a Christological iconography model to represent both the entry of the future victors into the new land and a projection across the ocean of what Christianity was. The face-to-face meeting between the conqueror ship and the Indian who has climbed the tree is in fact the Mexican version of the encounter between Jesus and Zacchaeus, who, according to the New Testament, when Jesus entered Jerusalem, climbed a sycamore tree to be able to see the arrival of the Messiah. This symbolic image of the arrival of Christianity is omnipresent in medieval art, from Syria to Armenia to Greece to Duccio to Lorenzetti to Giotto. Okay, so it's really an iconic image also of Western medieval art. However, the painter of the Florentine, the Duran Codex has not just borrowed an iconography. He has taken the initiative of openly conjugating the eschatological message of the biblical episode with the portrait of an extant point of the coast of Veracruz, the place where Cortés made his definitive entry into the interior of the land, tierra adentro. The artist has probably also been able to resort to iconographic elements of pre-Hispanic tradition, similar to the presentation of the Tamoanchan tree in the Codex Findobonense. But it's the representation of the landscape that really calls my attention. That representation of the landscape of the arrival condenses a narrative register and several iconographic levels, biblical and Mesoamerican. But it also conjugates a cartographic dimension with a valuable historical approach. By locating the first face-to-face meeting between the conquerors and the Mexica at a precise point of the coast, the painter shows that he knew the geography of the conquest well, that he was able to imagine and concretely visualize the arrival of the Spaniards on both a symbolic level and a realistic one. In fact, this site is in the vicinity of Quiahuiztlan, a Totonac domain inhabited by about 15,000 people when the Spaniards arrived, where Cortés established in 1519 the first solid alliances with the local population, alliances that would enable him to advance toward Tenochtitlan and to orchestrate the overthrow of the Mexica domination. In a portrait of rare perspicacity, the historian Fernando Alva de Islixochi described what Cortés felt after receiving the first signs of trust on the part of the coastal people. I quote, "He saw that he had turned the whole land upside down because he was friends of both camps and he could trick them with this duplicity. It was precisely on this skill and prowess that his good fortune rested, because this was when the path opened up that would give him all what he claimed." Therefore, it was only after having begun to turn the land upside down, to alter pre-Hispanic territorial and political organization, that the conqueror succeeded in conducting his conquest. Quiahuiztlan is therefore a key site in history because this is where Cortés announced to his soldiers that a return to Spain was impossible. The ships had been scuppered, and so the men could only go forward. Again, Islixochi. He gathered at the square all those who had been disheartened and miserable. He ended by telling them there was no longer the solution of going back because the ships were destroyed. The image from the Codex Duran shows with an almost photographic rendering the site of the arrival. In fact, that is the great mountain on the right is indeed the Cerro de los Metate Quiahuiztlan, later rebaptized Cerro Bernal for the first name of the conquistador Bernal Díaz del Castillo. One detail, interestingly, was added in the Florentine Codex to mark the same site, and the site that it was indeed a Totonac domain. In the image that opens Book 12 that we have already addressed and listened during this day, the painter has combined in a single snapshot several moments of the arrival that we know very well are the disembarkment of things, the animals, etc., the writing, the first communication. But I would like to call your attention on precisely the little houses that stand under the very strange circular platform where this tree is growing. So Diana Magaloni has also found that probably that the image of the arrival of Christ in Jerusalem had an impact in the creation of the Florentine Codex. Here, however, you see the little Zacchaeus that we saw in the other image. Here, she proposes that this is also a kind of reinterpretation of the presence of these Zacchaeus in the entrance of Christ in Jerusalem. What interests me mostly is the detail of these little houses here. So a tree, most probably a reference also to the tree of Zacchaeus, grows on a circular platform and not on the ground, as if the painter wanted consciously or unconsciously to separate the two elements or iconography that the Durand Codex had interwoven. Let us linger over one detail. At the foot of the tree, some very small houses, disproportionate in relationship to the rest of the painting, notably to the messenger Zacchaeus, surround this circular platform for no apparent reason. One might have explained it 30 years ago, this difference in scale by the Tlacuilo's poor interpretation of the laws of perspective. But looking closely, these small houses might also refer to the particular site where the conquistadors set foot in land, tierra dentro, that is in Quiahuistlan. Here, archaeologists have uncovered a triple pre-Hispanic cemetery dotted with 78 model houses that served as tombs, very similar to those surrounding the circular platform at the foot of the tree. The reference to the Totonac cemetery in Quiahuistlan represents yet another point of departure to approach the image, forcing us to reweave its texture. We cannot but restart anew. So, to conclude, let us now ask some questions. What do these images do to art history? Can we take them simply as a representation of the arrival of the strangers, or do they tell us something new about the practice of art history? Where do we place them in the tale of art history? Are we happy with the label of post-conquest images or colonial images, when in fact they escape any stable positioning? They cannot be assigned a linear, philological, nor genealogical position within a given series. These images are, however, incomprehensible without being able to navigate medieval iconography, biblical references, but also pre-Hispanic archaeology, Renaissance rhetoric, or geography. So, is the solution to consume these images in an encyclopedic erudition? Is it the solution to know it all? Or rather, is it the solution, a little bit more advisable, to move our eyes on the details in search of how our interpretation will be destabilized anew? The practice of untiringly looking anew defines, I think, a singular art history under condition of these particular kind of images, images that escape any disciplinary art history. May we think of this art history as an unfinished art history, an art history that thoroughly observes and searches to give shape to a singular interpretation, and yet leaves the analysis and interpretation always open to a new look, to look anew, because it cannot completely represent the complexity and astonishing creativity of these objects. This is the internal paradox of thinking art history with 1519. We are measured with images whose complexity cannot but be approached by this continuous and rigorous close looking and close searching. But from the other side, the inexhaustible creative complexity of these images remain and need to remain unrepresentable by a single stable interpretation. This is how they constitute a formidable intellectual and subjective possibility for all of us, starting with the students who can invent their own art histories. So here I just want to finish with two little references to projects. So this has been a project that we did at the UNAM several years ago with the students of the Instituto de Investigaciones Estéticas, where we did a exposición virtual, a virtual exhibition, where each one of these students looked at the same image, which is in fact the image of one of the images of the conference, and proposed a different interpretation. So this was exactly to demonstrate the richness, the internal richness. Within the same group taking the same course, there were almost a dozen of different interpretations. So it is this inexhaustibility, that recites perhaps the truth of these images, of their creative processes, and of how our own laborious encounter with them. And the second point that I want to make, really to finish, to conclude this presentation, it's a little bit more personal, but I thought it was perhaps, it's important for me to say that. It was in 1993 in Leiden that I met for the first time an image made in New Spain. It was a pintura de pluma, like those who are fantastically unveiling in museums like this one at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, or the recent one that appeared in Paris and is now at the Musée du Quai Branly. These images have been able to change my path radically. As an Italian student in Leiden in '93, my attraction was not, and is not today, motivated by any ethnic or national quest. I have not the chance of being Mexican, nor Chicana, nor indigenous, but there is something in these images that have shaped my identity as a subjective identity. These images have certainly given shape to a different self. By this I mean that working on these images, I and we can become someone else. For a strange path, today I'm returning to Italy as a scholar, thanks in fact to a Getty Foundation project that I co-direct with Michael Collis, a connecting art history project called Spanish Italy and the Iberian Americas. This return to Italy, however, is informed by that specific art history that I have learned in New Spain. It's a specific art history that I've learned through and with 1519, by that practice of looking again and again and let a little bit the interpretation unfinish. So I look to Italy through my training in New Spain. This is how far rethinking art history with 1519 has brought me these days. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. We're going to take a little bit of a break, so a 10-minute break, and then we'll return after. So go ahead and stretch your legs as we prepare.